Hello and greetings to everyone. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. We're delighted to welcome you to the first ever entirely virtual program hosted and organized by the Stanford Historical Society. My name is Leslie Kim. I serve on the board of the Historical Society and also as co-chair of the program committee. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar on John Carl Warnecke. Before I introduce Paul, I want to welcome two special guests from the Warnecke family who are with us today. We have Margot Warnecke-Merck, who is John Carl Warnecke's daughter, and Alice Warnecke-Sutro, who is his granddaughter and Margot's niece. They are also both Stanford alumni who manage the Warnecke Ranch and Vineyards in Healdsburg, including the Warnecke Archives in which they are standing at this very moment. Hello, Margot and Alice.
Hi, welcome
We're
live
so
from the archives. We're in an old dairy barn where both my grandfather and father's archives ended up. And we are thrilled to be sharing this moment with Paul, who has worked with us recently to complete our appraisal archives with Sven Brunchen. And we are thrilled to be here with you.
Fantastic, and we're so happy to have both of you with us. So we'll see you at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And now to our main event. We are so lucky to have Paul V. Turner speaking to us today. Paul trained as both an architect and an art historian at Harvard. In 1971, he joined Stanford's Department of Art and Art History, where he taught a broad range of architectural history courses. His publications include major works on the architects Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Joseph Ramey. His book on the history and development of American campuses earned him the 1984 Hitchcock Prize from the Society of Architectural Historians for the best book on architecture. Earlier this year, that society honored him again by naming him as a fellow. Paul's many contributions to Stanford include a period as chair of the University Committee on Land and Building Development in the 1980s. In the wake of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, he chaired the Stanford Committee charged with the complicated restoration of Frank Lloyd Wright's seriously damaged Hannah House. This increased his longtime interest in Wright, and in 2017, Yale University Press published his stunning book, Frank Lloyd Wright and San Francisco, covering 29 projects Wright had planned in the Bay Area. He has also co-authored or contributed essays to books on Stanford architecture, from the early design of the university and the creation of the Stanford Museum to the buildings we know today that comprise the modern campus. More recently, Paul has been studying the life and work of John Carl Warnecke, Stanford class of 41, about whom he will be presenting today. Thank you all again for joining us, and without further ado, I'll turn things over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Leslie. Excuse me. And first, let me thank the Historical Society for asking me to give this talk, and then for organizing it as a webinar when the originally planned lecture had to be canceled. And I especially want to thank Karen Bartholomew for her efforts to facilitate the event. Well, during all the years that I taught at Stanford, I was aware of the architect John Carl Warnecke, mainly as the designer of several buildings on the campus, such as the bookstore and post office. And here, of course, we see the bookstore and the art building, where I taught my courses, and which I always considered an excellent building. Its recent demolition is regrettable, in my opinion. But I have to admit that I did not know much about Warnecke's career and work in general. It's only more recently that I've learned about its significance in the overall picture of American architecture in the mid-20th century. And it's not only me. Warnecke's work is not as well known generally as it deserves to be, and I'll make some suggestions later about why this may be. So I'll be describing Warnecke's career and his buildings, but I'll touch on some other things as well, such as the local angle. Warnecke was a Bay Area native and a Stanford alumnus, and made some important but little known contributions to the development of Stanford architecture, aside from the buildings themselves that he designed. And then there's the story of Warnecke's relationship with John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy family, and especially with Jackie Kennedy following the president's assassination. So there's a lot to talk about, but I'll try to cover as much as possible. Warnecke was born in 1919 in Oakland, the son of an architect, Carl I. Warnecke, who had a practice there. And here we see him as a young man. Carl Warnecke had an interesting career himself, which we can't get into here, but I will mention one thing. As a young man working in architectural offices in San Francisco, and this was around 1910, Carl saved up his earnings and went to Paris and took the exams for admission to the École des Beaux-Arts, the most prestigious architecture school in the world at that time. And he was admitted and joined one of the ateliers at the École. Unfortunately, World War I soon broke out, and Carl had to leave Paris and return home. And here in the next slide, we see a local newspaper article about him at that time. But in the process of being at the École for a while, and also from apprenticing with classical architects in San Francisco, such as Arthur Brown Jr., he was trained in the Beaux-Arts system of design, including executing drawings in the beautiful and meticulous Beaux-Arts manner. And here we see a couple of his academic exercises. And his later work reflected this classical tradition in various ways. So this was the architectural environment that John Carl Warnecke grew up in, because he was trained by his father from an early age. He once said, "I was lucky to grow up under my father's drafting board." His own architecture was, of course, going to be modern, not traditional. But this background influenced his thinking, as he himself later acknowledged. He said, "I recognized how different I was from other architects of my generation. From the start, I could not ignore the beautiful Beaux-Arts architecture of my father and his contemporaries, such as Arthur Brown Jr." This was the Brown of Bakewell and Brown, the architects of many of our Stanford buildings, as many of you no doubt know. And I'll suggest later the relevance of this to some of Warnecke's important ideas and innovations. Well, when it came time for John Carl Warnecke to go to college, or Jack as he was usually called, instead of going to an architecture school, he decided to get a broader liberal arts education, at least at first, and he came to Stanford. He later said that another motive was that he got a football scholarship here. And during his time at Stanford, he was mainly known as a member of the undefeated team that won the Rose Bowl in the 1940 season. And here we see a photo of him in action and a photo of the team. He's on the right there, number 31. And next slide is his graduation photo from Stanford, his Stanford graduation photo. He did take some architecture courses at Stanford, what there was at the time, and spent a summer working in Arthur Brown's office in San Francisco. And then after graduating, he went to the design school at Harvard, where he was able to finish his architecture degree in just 1 year due to the professional experience he already had. He then joined his father's firm in Oakland, where, among other work, they produced a large wartime housing project in Richmond for the workers at the Kaiser shipyards there. And here we see one of the firm's drawings for this large project. Jack Warnecke was married in 1945, and he and his wife had 4 children, one of whom, Margot, also graduated from Stanford and then got an architecture degree and worked in her father's firm. He died in 2010, and Margot now oversees the family operations at the Warnecke Ranch in Sonoma County, as we already know, because she and her niece Alice have been introduced to us already. And she and the two of them have kindly agreed to join us, as Leslie pointed out, in this webinar for the question and answer period that will follow. And so I'm delighted be able to have them join me for this question and answer period. But to get back to our story, in 1946, Jack Warnecke opened his own architectural office while still in his 20s, first in Oakland, and then he moved his office to San Francisco. And soon he was designing buildings that attracted national attention for their innovative qualities. And here we see one of these buildings, a school of about 1950 in El Cerrito in the East Bay. It's called the Mira Vista Elementary School, which may not look that unusual to us today, but in fact was very innovative for that time, when most buildings were either traditional in style or modernist in a kind of ultra-functional, standardized way. And perhaps the best way to get an idea of what was new here is to quote from an article on the school that appeared in Newsweek magazine soon after it opened. And here we see this article. You probably can't read it, but that's the article that was in Newsweek magazine. Let me quote from it. Increasingly, the trend in designing new public schools has been to make them as functional as possible. But John Carl Warnecke, 32-year-old architect of San Francisco, thinks they should also be beautiful and centered around the child. This is seen in his elementary school in El Cerrito. By last week, visitors had flocked to see it from points as far away as Australia. The school overlooks San Francisco Bay and seems to hug the side of a hill. It has a continuous roof which ties the whole structure together and provides covered walks on the side away from the bay so that winds and fog will not buffet or drench the children. Jutting from the rocky slope, the roof slants as though the wind had set its angle. Wallace Harrison, co-architect of Rockefeller Center in the United Nations buildings, has placed Mira Vista among the 10 best buildings designed in the United States since the Second World War, unquote. And it's really quite amazing that Warnecke got this kind of national attention so early in his career. Probably the best word to describe what Warnecke was doing here is contextual, a term that he himself began using a little later and which came to represent an important movement in modern architecture. Basically, it had to do with treating each design on its own terms and responding to its individual characteristics or context, whether topographic considerations or cultural, climatic, functional, or other aspects. And to understand this better, we can go back a bit in time to an episode that I think was pivotal in Warnecke's development, and it happened here at Stanford. At about the end of World War II, Stanford had created the university's planning office and appointed the architect Eldridge Spencer to head it up. Spencer was a thorough modernist, and he made a clean break with the traditional Stanford architecture, that of the original quadrangles and then the buildings of Bakewell and Brown, with their red tile roofs, sandstone walls, and arches and arcades. This break with tradition became shockingly apparent when Spencer's plans were announced in the Alumni Review in 1948 for a new dormitory complex, Stern Hall, an uncompromisingly modern structure of exposed concrete and flat roofs with little or no resemblance to what people considered to be Stanford architecture. And here in the next slide, we see another, from another Alumni Review article, we see the design of Stern Hall at the bottom and comparing it to Lagunita Court, which had been built only about a dozen years earlier. Many members of the Stanford community were greatly upset, especially among the alumni, and there was a deluge of protests. And here we see just a few of the letters that were sent to the Alumni Review. Warnecke, as a recent Stanford alumnus who was now a Bay Area architect, was asked by several other alumni for his opinion on this issue. He took the request seriously, and in 1949, he produced a lengthy report. Here we see the title page. I should point out that it was never published, And so it exists only in typed form. There are several copies, one in the Stanford archives, but it's not generally known. It's really almost an unknown document. And in this report, Warnecke first reviewed the controversy over Stern Hall and then used it as an opportunity to formulate some general principles about designing new buildings in an historical setting, such as Stanford's. In one section of the report, entitled, "Should Emotions Have Any Bearing on the Architecture of the University?" And here we see the first page of that section, Warnecke argued that contemporary buildings must be functional and use up-to-date structural systems, but their design should take into account the appeal of the traditional character of their surroundings. He wrote, quote, "How can emotions be divorced from the new buildings which must stand side by side with the symbols of the university? The architect must cope with them. He must find the happy combination of a functional building which will also incorporate the emotional qualities of the architectural styles of the existing buildings," unquote. This was very different from the general attitude of modern architects of that period, and it was a kind of manifesto, we might say, of a new approach. Warnecke was not advocating a return to traditional architectural styles, as some conservative architects still did. He was a modern architect, but he wanted to acknowledge and take advantage of tradition when it was appropriate. In his report, he developed this idea in some detail, arguing, for example, that Stanford's traditional red tile roofs, which virtually all modern architects consider to be antiquated and impractical, actually had advantages, even from a functional point of view, and that their emotional appeal was an additional plus which could not be ignored. He examined other aspects of Stanford architecture in a similar way and made a thoughtful case for balancing the functional needs of contemporary building with the positive qualities of an existing architectural environment or context. Now, I think that Warnecke's background must have predisposed him to this new approach, especially his appreciation for the traditional architecture his father had represented. But I suspect that it was this Stanford episode that really crystallized the issue for him and set him on the path that was to characterize much of his architecture from then on. For example, that school in El Cerrito and many other buildings in the following years. So let's see a couple of these, a couple more of these early buildings. Excuse me, I just took a sip of water. In 1956, he was chosen by the U.S. State Department to design a new U.S. Embassy building in Bangkok. To prepare for designing it, he made an intensive study visit to Thailand to meet with local architects and artisans, as he put it, and study the historical architecture of Thailand. That was a quote that he wrote about this, discussing it later. The resulting design, which we see here, was very different from typical modern buildings of the period. An article in the magazine Architectural Record described it as follows. The elegance of the design for the new embassy blends the cultural traditions of two peoples, the Thais and the Americans, and yet achieves an identity of its own. In its subtle recollection of Thai religious architecture and of local architectural detail, the building imparts the feeling of serenity and peace so much associated with Far Eastern philosophies. Now, unfortunately, this embassy design was not executed due to a coup in Thailand in 1957. But the general admiration of it led to Warnecke's next major commission, that of the Hawaii State Capitol in Honolulu, which was built, of course, over a period of several years. Like the Bangkok design, the Hawaii Capitol took the context into account in various ways. An article on it in another magazine, Architectural Forum, said this: The Hawaii Capitol is the first major governmental building in the US to be entrusted to a leading modern architect. And it said that this was because modern architects were known for producing only functional structures, but Warnecke was different. Quote, Warnecke and his associates had to solve complex functional problems, but in addition, they created a symbol that reflects the tropical splendor of the island. The structure of the building is a ring of 24 concrete columns, which recall the many trunks of the banyan tree. Most of these columns stand in a large reflecting pool that cools the walls of the House and Senate chambers. We can't actually see that large reflecting pool in these two photographs. This, going back to the article, it says, the symbolism is effective. A new and lovely state in miniature, composed of many islands surrounded by the Pacific and fanned by ocean breezes, unquote. Now, I'm not sure that Warnecke had exactly this kind of symbolism in mind, but the point is that the architectural profession was now recognizing in Warnecke's work a new approach to modern architecture. And at the same time that Warnecke began designing this Hawaii Capitol building, that is about 1958, he received his first commission at Stanford for a new bookstore and post office. And this allowed him finally to put into effect the principles that he had formulated in that 1949 report. What we're seeing here are two photographs that were taken soon after the construction of these two buildings in 1959. And the upper one shows the east side of the bookstore. That is the back side, away from White Plaza, where in addition to the building was later put. So we don't actually see the building, or can't see the building this way today. And the lower photograph shows that connecting arcade that links the bookstore to the post office that we see there. The structural system of these two new buildings was completely contemporary, using in part an advanced technology of precast concrete elements. But they created forms that clearly related to the original Stanford architecture, with red tile roofs and arcades that connect the two buildings and that are surround the two buildings. And again, the design attracted national attention in the architectural profession. Here we see a page on the left here from an article in Architectural Record that illustrates one of the precast concrete vaulted sections being lowered onto the columns. And I put a blow up of that photograph on the right there so you can see it a little better. And next to the photograph in the article, you see that there's a small photo of one of the arcades in the main quad. The text of the article emphasized this connection. Quote, in these two new buildings for Stanford University, the design successfully combines a conscious recall of traditional elements of the earlier campus buildings, but with contemporary design, materials, and construction methods. The long, flat-arched arcade, using the technical vocabulary of our time, ties together visually the two new buildings and allies them with the old. The red tile roofs, the tan color of the concrete stucco finish, and its slightly roughened surface are a sensitive response to the context of the site and the tradition of the Richardsonian buildings on the campus, unquote. By Richardsonian, this is a reference, of course, to the quad buildings. And this really set a pattern at Stanford for new buildings that would acknowledge the historical architecture of the university, a pattern that's continued, of course, and is still being used today in one way or another. Indeed, in my opinion, the bookstore and post office may be the most successful of all of these attempts to harmonize the old and the new in Stanford architecture. And here we just see some more photographs of the buildings today. These are photographs I took about a year ago. And in any case, there's no question that these two buildings played an important role pointing to a new direction in the development of architecture at Stanford. Warnecke soon was getting commissions for other buildings at Stanford, and let's just see several of them rather quickly before moving on. There's the art building, designed in 1965, which I already mentioned, and here at the top we see another photo of it. And some of you may recognize in this photo my late colleague, Al Elson, who was the creator of the outdoor sculpture program at Stanford. And another one of Warnecke's buildings, Maples Pavilion, designed about 1967. And Meyer Library of about the same time. Here at the top is one of the Warnecke firm's elevations drawings for Meyer. Now I know that that this was some people's favorite building to dislike at Stanford while it was still standing, or at least it was controversial and people had different opinions about it. And perhaps one could question some aspects of the design. For example, the vaulted forms somehow seem a little less successful, at least in my opinion, when they're raised up so high. But this was partly, I think, the result of the building's program, which required a tall, bulky structure, perhaps a bit out of place at Stanford. More successful, perhaps, were Warnecke's designs for a number of student residences, originally fraternities, starting in 1960, right after the bookstore and post office were built. Two groups of student residences located in the area between the lake, Lagunita, and Campus Drive East. They were designed in two groups, as I suggested, two stages, the first of which is shown in the architect's rendering that we see here at the top. Each residence being and there are four of them here in this stage, each residence being a cluster of buildings, as Warnecke called them, to create a smaller, more intimate scale rather than having large dormitory buildings. The photo here at the bottom is one of these clusters in this first stage. Warnecke gave these buildings an informal, almost rural kind of style to increase their intimate or residential character, and also because of the wooded nature of this part of the campus. And in the next view here, we see the architect's rendering of the second phase of clusters that was closer to Lagunita, as you can see that in that architect's rendering of it, and at the bottom two photos of two of these clusters. These buildings, as you can see, are in a slightly different style with red tile roofs, but still with a kind of informal residential character, due mainly, I think, to that cluster concept. And in my opinion, they've aged very, very well. Let's see one more slide with these photos from the first cluster groups taken soon after their construction. In my opinion, they were very successful designs. Nevertheless, I think it's still the bookstore and post office that were Warnecke's most important contribution to Stanford architecture, as they introduced that new contextual approach to campus design. Excuse me. But for a while, I wondered, how were these buildings perceived at the time by the Stanford community? Was I the only one who thought they were that significant? And then just about a month ago, Karen Bartholomew came across an article and brought it to my attention in the June 1960 issue of the Stanford Alumni Review, just after the buildings had opened. An article written by the magazine's editor, Dan Ensley. And let me quote from it a bit. Another sip of water. Quote, "I think the new bookstore and post office are the most delightful additions to the Stanford scene in the past 15 years. And I am not alone. They were prime attractions at the campus conference last month. And here is the consensus. The buildings, although completely modern in concept, design, function, and the materials used, fit neatly into the Stanford landscape because while looking ahead, they have continuity with the past. The architect had a feel for Stanford and its architectural tradition that surpasses anything seen around here for a long time. Perhaps that's because he himself is a Stanford man, Jack Warnecke. And I should add to attest my objectivity that I've never met him. I just like his buildings. If they only happen to please me personally, that wouldn't mean much. But when so many others agree, the information should be passed along, unquote. That was Dan Ensley, his article. So their significance was recognized at the time. And that's no doubt why I think they changed the direction of subsequent Stanford architecture. Well, we could look at other important designs by Warnecke of this period, such as his buildings at the Asilomar Conference Center, which were widely praised for the way they related both to the topography of the site and to the earlier Asilomar buildings, which had been designed by Julia Morgan. But let's turn now to a completely different aspect of Warnecke's life and career, his remarkable relationship with John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy family. Warnecke first met Kennedy in 1956, when Kennedy was a Massachusetts senator. One of Warnecke's Stanford fraternity brothers had been Paul Fay, who knew Kennedy because they both were PT boat captains in the Second World War. And Fay had become a close friend and aide to Kennedy as he began his political career. And here we see a photo of the two of them, Kennedy and Fay. Fay invited Warnecke to come to a talk that Kennedy was giving in San Francisco in 1956. And he introduced them, and Warnecke and Kennedy immediately took a liking to each other. Partly, I think, because of their shared interest in football. Also, they were just about the same age. In the following years, they met again on a couple of occasions, and in 1962, with Kennedy now president, Warnecke happened to be in Washington to serve on an architectural jury, and Paul Fay, who was now Undersecretary of the Navy, invited him to visit the president in the White House, at which time Kennedy learned more about Warnecke's architectural career. And the next day, Kennedy called Warnecke and asked if he could give him some advice on, quote, an architectural problem. Warnecke changed his plans and stayed in Washington and met with one of Kennedy's advisors. And it turned out that the architectural problem had to do with Lafayette Square, the square directly to the north of the White House across Pennsylvania Avenue. In the 19th century, the square had been flanked on the east and west sides by row houses, but some of them had been replaced by other kinds of buildings in the early 20th century, and the government had decided to demolish all of these buildings on both sides of the square and to replace them with large government structures, an office building and a federal court building, really huge structures. And these new buildings were already being designed by a prestigious Boston architectural firm. Well, now Warnecke later found out that when Kennedy had become president, Jackie Kennedy had learned of these plans and was upset by the idea of demolishing the 19th century row houses on Lafayette Square, some of whom had been lived in the 19th century by important people. And Jackie Kennedy, of course, was an early supporter of architectural preservation. And she had asked her husband if he could look into the matter. Warnecke spent 2 days learning about the project and formulating his ideas on it. And he then made a presentation to Kennedy in the cabinet room in the White House, in which he proposed that the original residential character of the square could be recovered, in a sense, by adding new row houses to the existing ones, by tearing down some of the 20th century buildings that had been added, and recovering the residential nature of the square by adding new row houses and placing the large new government buildings that were required behind them. He later recalled, quote, by designing the new buildings as backdrops to the older 19th century buildings, these structures, meaning the 19th century ones, many with meaningful history, would become a feature of the new design. The solution was to move the massive buildings off the square and to reestablish its residential scale, unquote. So again, we can see Warnecke's contextual thinking, this time applied to urban planning, or applied in a slightly different way. Well, when Warnecke presented this idea to Kennedy at this meeting in the cabinet room, Kennedy was intrigued and asked some questions that led to discussion of more detailed aspects of the problem. It was a long meeting, apparently. And Kennedy concluded the meeting by saying to the advisors who were with him there, "Let's do it." Warnecke assumed that Kennedy would pass the proposal on to the GSA, the General Services Administration, and to the Boston architectural firm that was planning the project. To his shock, he got a call later that day from one of the GSA directors telling him, "The president has fired the Boston architects and he wants you to do it." Well, this presented Warnecke with some problems, including the professional ethics issue of appearing to steal a commission from another architectural firm. But as he later said, he couldn't refuse the president's wishes. He had to open an office in Washington and begin working on the project, which turned out to be tremendously complicated. Jackie, of course, was delighted and followed the project closely. And here we see a couple of photos of Warnecke showing her some of his drawings and a model of the project. On the right is a long drawing, as you can see, of the row houses and how he was handling them to recover the residential character of the square. And on the left, we see them with that model of the west side, I believe, of Lafayette Square. And you can see just a bit of the tall office building, the new building that they're pointing to, surrounded by the restored townhouses. By the way, if Jackie's outfit looks familiar, it's because it's what she was later wearing on the day of the assassination in Dallas. Well, Warnecke's Lafayette Square plans were eventually executed several years later. And here we see the east and west sides of the square, with Warnecke's new government buildings behind the restored 19th century buildings. And it's considered to be a milestone of sorts in the development of this kind of contextual or historical thinking in American urban planning. And it's hard to realize fully today, I think, how controversial it was at the time, especially within the architectural profession, most of whose members thought it was ridiculous to preserve old townhouses in the center of a major city. Warnecke later came across the minutes of a meeting of the Commission of Fine Arts in Washington right after his plans were announced. Several of the members of the commission, who were prominent architects, were adamantly opposed to Warnecke's plans. One of them, a former president of the American Institute of Architects, said, quote, "There is nothing on that side of the square worth preserving. Architecturally, it is junk." And another one said, "All these little bits of houses along the street are going to make the United States look ridiculous architecturally. I think to preserve the old Corcoran Art Gallery or the Dolly Madison House is pure folly," unquote. And I mention this to point out that what Warnecke was doing was actually rather radical at that time. And he was probably taking some risks professionally to take this position. By the way, that reference to the old Corcoran Art Gallery is interesting. This was the Victorian era building that's now called the Renwick Gallery, which was in poor condition and would have been demolished if Warnecke's plan had not been adopted. Eventually, Warnecke himself oversaw its restoration, and it's just one of several historic buildings in Washington that he helped preserve. Another one is the old executive office building across from the White House. Architectural preservation was another field in which Warnecke was active at a time when it was not of much interest to most modern architects. Well, President Kennedy supported Warnecke fully in his Lafayette Square plans, and in fact, he gave him commissions for some other important projects, including a somewhat similar undertaking at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And he involved Warnecke in the preliminary plans for a Kennedy library. In May of 1963, the two of them spent a full day in Cambridge, Massachusetts, examining potential sites for the library. And here we see them there. At that time, it was thought that the Kennedy Library would probably be in Cambridge. And it was expected that Warnecke would eventually design the building. But then, of course, Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. After he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Jackie asked Warnecke to visit the site with her and with Robert Kennedy to give them advice about how the area around the grave might be developed. And here we see the three of them at the site at that time, very shortly after Kennedy's assassination. Warnecke gave them some ideas which they liked about the gravesite, and they then asked him to take charge of the project. This led to a complex and drawn-out process in which Warnecke was expected to satisfy all the members of the Kennedy family, some of whom had very different ideas about the gravesite than he did. The president's sister, Eunice, for example, wanted lots of religious symbolism, including statues of angels, in contrast to Warnecke's desire for a dignified simplicity. But finally, Jackie insisted that Warnecke's concept prevail, and he developed it in drawings and models. Here we see a couple of the drawings, which when the final plan was publicly announced, won universal praise for various aspects of the design. For example, its approach along an axis that was aligned with the Lincoln Memorial, and we see that in the drawing at the bottom there, and the plan's solution to the functional problems of providing space for visitors to the grave and their circulation, the patterns of circulation, and its emphasis on the natural environment. And ever since its execution, it's been considered one of the best designed features of the capital city's landscape. Well, in working on this project, Warnecke spent a good deal of time conferring with Jackie, and in the process, they gradually became emotionally close. Warnecke was single. He had been divorced from his wife in 1960, and he and Jackie began a romantic relationship, which over the next couple of years grew in intensity as they spent more and more time together. Here we see one of the few photos of them during this period. Jackie would invite Warnecke to visit her at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport and at her mother's estate in Newport, Rhode Island, and in New York City, and at a private retreat that she had in New Jersey. Warnecke got to know Jackie's children, and his children got to know Jackie. At one point in 1966, Jackie flew to Hawaii and spent a month with Warnecke at his house in the hills outside Honolulu. Ostensibly, she was staying with a couple of her friends there. And it was generally known in the Kennedy family that they intended to marry. They had tried to keep their relationship discreet, but inevitably began to leak out and get reported in the press, at least in the tabloid press. At one point, Jackie's sister, Lee Radziwill, was quoted as saying they were definitely going to get married. And the news was picked up even in Europe. The French magazine Dimanche reported that Jackie has chosen her second husband, as you can see from the headline there, and identified him as John Carl Warnecke, describing him as un très riche architecte. But unfortunately, this article was wrong about this one point. At this time, Warnecke was not a very rich architect. Even though he had a large architectural firm, he suddenly discovered in 1966 that the firm was in serious financial trouble. It turned out that there were several reasons for this, one of which was the excessive attention that he had been giving to those Washington, D.C. projects. He later talked about it. Quote, and this is in a memoir that he wrote a number of years later. Quote, what I realized was that I had spent an inordinate amount of time over the past few years on the design of Lafayette Square and JFK's gravesite. And now I found myself with without enough new work. Plus there were problems because of the exceptionally low bids of the new executive office building and court building for Lafayette Square. And he also mentioned the large amount of time he had spent with Jackie. Back to his remarks, he said, all this and the economic situation of the time were financially catching up with me. I had no other choice but to return to my main San Francisco base in the fall of 1966 and deal with this sudden crisis. If I didn't get the firm back on its feet quickly, the bind we were in could have a tremendous long-term effect on my family, staff, and practice, unquote. In Warnecke's unpublished memoir, that was written after Jackie's death, he says that when he broke the news to her and said he couldn't continue seeing her the way they had been seeing each other, they were both upset. He also said he realized that Jackie needed a secure and protected life and that this required a lot of money, which he did not have. By the following summer, Warnecke was pulling the firm together again, as he later said. He still went back east occasionally to see Jackie, but, quote, life was moving us in different directions. And here's another photo of them back at the time of the Lafayette Square design. The shock of Bobby Kennedy's assassination in June of '68 must have intensified Jackie's concern with security, and it was only 4 months later that she married Aristotle Onassis. In the following years, Warnecke and Jackie continued to keep in touch and occasionally to see each other. And there's evidence that they maintained very affectionate feelings for each other for the rest of their lives and regretted that things hadn't worked out differently for them. Well, what does all of this have to do with Warnecke's architecture? For one thing, the time and attention that Warnecke spent on Jackie, and especially on the Kennedy projects that meant so much to her, contributed to his business problems, as he himself later said, as we saw. Also, the crisis seems to have motivated him to concentrate on making his firm as financially successful as possible. And in this, he succeeded very well. In the following years, he built up his firm to the point that by the mid-1970s, it was ranked as having the highest volume of business of any architectural firm in the country, and therefore probably the world. Here's a page or a double page spread from an industry, a construction industry magazine of that period, with the ranking of architectural firms, showing the Warnecke firm at the top of the list on the right-hand page there. At first, I was kind of dubious about this. I wondered, for example, where is SOM on this list? Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. But it turns out that SOM was a combination architecture engineering firm, which was a different category in this particular ranking. For architecture firms, strictly speaking, Warnecke's was apparently the biggest at this time in volume of business. He had created a firm that received hundreds of large commissions in many parts of the world of almost all building types, high-rise office buildings and hotels. Here, an office building on Fifth Avenue in New York on the left, and a hotel in Hawaii. Company headquarters buildings, here 2 of them in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. housing complexes of various kinds. Here, a condominium complex in Palm Beach, Florida, above, and in the lower photograph, Opera Plaza, that complex in San Francisco. Commercial buildings and shopping centers, here 2 of them in Las Vegas and Northbrook, Illinois. Government buildings, here the County Government Center in Ventura, California, and the Hennepin County Government Center in Minneapolis. And airports, here Logan Airport in Boston, the South Terminal, one of several airport terminals designed by Warnecke's firm. And one of his main specialties was university design, with master plans and buildings for many colleges and universities. In fact, roughly 50 different institutions. Here we see part of his, the drawings for his master plan for U.C. Santa Cruz, begun in the 1960s. And here, Warnecke's main building on the Santa Cruz campus, the library. He also continued doing major projects in Washington, D.C. For example, the Hart Senate office building of the early 1980s, in which the design reflects certain patterns and proportions of the earlier classical style buildings in its surroundings, such as the adjacent Dirksen Senate office building that we see just a little bit of in the photograph at the top there. And we know that, that Warnecke was purposely making his Washington buildings compatible with the architectural context, because he spoke about it. And we know that he studied classical buildings as he was doing these new designs. Here we see an interesting photograph of him in front of drawings that he had put up on the wall in his office, with a traditional classical building on the right, and one of his designs for another new building in Washington, this one in the Federal Triangle area, where he did important work. However, the fact is, so these buildings, and the one we see here, the Hart Senate office building, clearly had this kind of contextual aspect. However, the fact is that many of the other large projects of the 1970s and early 80s, some of which we have just seen, did not have clearly discernible contextual components. And this was due mainly, I think, to the nature of the commissions themselves and their programmatic requirements, but also the way that Warnecke had to operate now was different from before, with a very large staff in different branch offices to deal with the huge volume of business that he had. So he himself inevitably was not able to have a hands-on role in all of the projects, though he did in some of them, like these buildings in Washington. And this high volume nature of his later work, almost a kind of corporate nature, we might say, of his later work, may have contributed, I think, to the fact that Warnecke's career has not been appreciated by architects and historians to the extent that it deserves. The later work was perhaps just too voluminous to have the kind of distinctive character or consistent quality that makes an architect's career memorable. But there's another factor, I think, also, which ironically has to do with one of the positive aspects of the contextual approach. In contextualism, architectural designs respond to their individual conditions or environments, as we've seen, rather than having a preconceived form imposed on them. As Warnecke himself said, quote, "Each new building requires the designer to come up with a design solution that is unique for its time and place," unquote. As a result, there's no clearly apparent Warnecke style, in contrast to most of the other major, excuse me, in contrast to most of the other major architects of his generation, such as Eero Saarinen, Lou Kahn, Paul Rudolph, and others. And we can see this just by comparing some of Warnecke's most successful contextual designs, which each has its own special character. You wouldn't even recognize them as being by the same architect, perhaps. And so here we see four of them: the Mira Vista School, the Stanford Bookstore, Lafayette Square, and the Hart Senate Office Building. Or two more, the Hawaii Capitol and the buildings at Asilomar. From the contextual point of view, this is a virtue, that they all respond to their own contextual characteristics or conditions and do not look the same. But it perhaps has the disadvantage of making it hard to see the overall work or career as having a consistent or distinctive character. And this is just one of the fascinating and complicating aspects of Warnecke's architecture. Well, his career can no doubt be assessed in various ways, but a couple of points are clear. First, that he promoted this innovative approach to architecture, which came to be called contextualism. And significantly for us, the beginnings of Warnecke's approach are intimately connected to the Stanford campus, with his 1949 report and the effect that it ultimately had in establishing a new direction for Stanford architecture, a direction that recognized the greatness of the original Stanford buildings and incorporated their spirit into the university's contemporary architecture. We are fortunate here at Stanford to have had an alumnus who went on to such a significant architectural career and who, moreover, had such an important influence on the development of our campus. Thank you for attending this webinar talk. And now, I believe Leslie Kim is going to begin the discussion part of our event.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul. And now we're also going to bring back online our friends,
Alice.
Margot and Alice.
Okay.
Great. Thank
Hi,
you.
Margot. Hi, Alice.
Hi, Paul. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that wonderful presentation. Okay. So now what we'll do, well, first of all, Margot and Alice, I don't know if there's anything just briefly that you wanted to add about the archives and where you are before we launch into the questions.
Yeah, you might point out, Margot and Alice might point out that you are at the Warnecke Ranch in Sonoma County on the Russian River. That was John Carl Warnecke's ranch and estate, and that you're in the what's now the archive of his architecture and also that of his father.
That's correct. And it ended up all of his offices, there were 5 offices, all of the drawings and photography ended up here in this dairy in the middle of the vineyards. And so Alice and I are here. We are managing the ranch and vineyards here in Sonoma County. We do give tours of the archive if and when we can do that again. We would be delighted to have anyone who's interested in doing research. The archive itself is over 100 years of architectural practice in one spot. It's kind of unique. I mean, the Berkeley Architectural Archives have many different Bay Area architects, and here we have one firm and over 100 years of practice. So it's pretty unique, and we're also both, just to mention, students of Paul. So I want to throw that in. Yeah. Both Alice and I took Paul's classes, and
it was a pleasure to hear your voice again. And
well, thank you. Yeah, my voice was sort of fading in and out of there for a while. I think I hope I was audible and people could understand me.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, we heard you well. It was great.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I don't know. Have you received any questions from listeners, Leslie?
Yeah, we do have a few, which I will ask right now. And so what I'll do is I'll just kind of pose the questions in general, and you can decide which of you might be more equipped to answer them. So the first one that we have states, Tom Beischer points out that the post office was enclosed in the 1990s, which gives it a very different feel. He wonders why the post office and frat houses are praised for their contextual nature, but what do you think Warnecke's positioning of Meyer was about? Did he forget that buildings are supposed to flank axes instead of interrupting them?
Yeah, Tom is throwing a really complicated question at us. Tom Beischer, by the way, it was also one of my students and went on to become an architectural historian himself. And when I retired, he, for a number of years, continued teaching my courses and is still involved in the architecture and art program at Stanford. So I know Tom well, and he's raising questions that are difficult to answer. He's absolutely right that the post office has been altered in that it was enclosed in the periphery of the building was enclosed in a way that it was not originally. And I don't know whether, Margot, you were at Stanford, of course, before that happened. You were one of my students shortly after I began teaching in the 1970s, right? And do you remember? Do you remember anything about the post office and how it's different now from the way it was then, or?
No, I don't actually. Alice was mentioning how she appreciated when she was there, the glass and the experience of being able to.
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite buildings on the campus that Grandpa designed, and biking by and watching people get their mail. I think it's really unique, and I can imagine if it used to be open, maybe it would get too wet or rainy in there occasionally. So just closing it in for weather protection. But
yeah, and when I was at Stanford, the main library was called Ugly.
Yeah, that was unfortunate. The undergraduate library easily became called Ugly, and a lot of people said they didn't like it. Though I have met some people since its demolition. I've met several alumni who said they really miss it and who defended it. So it was a controversial building.
You know, and the red tile roofs, and I think the intent was important, and the master plan that he did create for Stanford was, I think, part of his overall vision, as you talked about in his report, for developing the campus in traditional ways.
Right, yeah. Any other question? We could spend more time trying to respond to Tom's questions, but let's see if what else you've received.
Okay. Well, this one is a question directed to Margot. And Margot, if it's not too intrusive, so it's totally at your discretion if you'd like to answer, can you describe your relationship with Jackie?
I was probably around 16 at the time, and was really not that, involved with the romance that was going on. I mean, their relationship was something very private. So I really, didn't have that much of an opportunity to get to know her. So.
But you met her, didn't you?
Oh, of course, yes. We met her. We spent summer in Hawaii, which I remember distinctly, because there's a lot of Secret Service around and things like that. But there wasn't that much of an opportunity for me personally to develop much of a relationship with her.
Yeah. Did you have any impressions of her as a was she, or, maybe you don't need to get into that, but I just wondered whether you had any sense of what kind of person she was.
Well, certainly, the significance of who she was present, but she seemed I've read a couple of, interesting books about her. So it's always, I just felt I personally was too young really to understand what was going on in that sense of who she really was and the significance of that at the time.
Any other questions, Leslie?
Well, maybe sort of a follow-up to that about Jackie. Do you think that she's not given enough credit generally for her preservation work? Is that because she was a woman and or not part of the profession?
Well, that's, yeah, I don't know whether Margot or Alice have any sense of this. I can't really answer that question very well because I've got to admit that I don't know that much about Jackie's preservation work. I know that she was very interested in it. She was involved, for example, in the attempts to save Pennsylvania Station, I believe. In New York, there was a big issue when they announced plans to demolish the great Pennsylvania Station, McKinley and White's great structure, and she was active in that, I believe. But I've never read enough about her preservation work to really be competent to answer that question. And whether it wasn't appreciated as much because she was a woman, I kind of doubt that. The fact that she was so well known, I think, if anything, made her views more important, and she probably was able to really sway people's opinions, partly just for the fact that who she was. Do you have any sense of that, Margot?
Yeah, I do. A lot of Jackie's involvement was very genuine and very active, especially in Lafayette Square, and continued throughout her life. She was a preservationist and well known for that. But her involvement in Lafayette Square was very genuine, and it's written quite extensively about in my father's memoirs, in great detail about, it was really her last stand to really save Lafayette Square and preserve the buildings. And it's something that I think without her involvement might not have happened as genuinely as, I guess, the project turned course with her advocacy to do something to preserve the square.
Right. Leslie, I can't hear your voice. Leslie?
Sorry, I just muted myself because I have a noisy cat in the background. I was trying to hide him.
I see, okay.
Yeah. So we have another question from a listener about the where you are right now. It looks like you're in a vineyard. Who's making the wine? Can we visit and have some wine?
Oh, great
Yeah.
segue. So Alice can talk about the wine that she is making from the grapes here at the Warnecke Ranch and Vineyard. And we both manage the ranch and vineyard, and then Alice has branched out.
Yeah, a couple, I started working for my family in 2010, and then after a few years in the field with Margot, just purely in vineyard work, I started a wine label. So it's brought a bottle to share. This is Sutro. That's my married name, and we have Warnecke Ranch right down here. So it's all vineyard designate wines. And I was gonna take the opportunity to say cheers to Paul, and I'm gonna do that now. And so from both Margot and I, in the archives, cheers. This is Cabernet Sauvignon. You can, I have it all available on my website, which is sutrowine.com. And after studying art history at Stanford, I got an art degree, which so I got the art bug from my family, clearly. And my dad, Fred Warnecke, is a landscape architect, so he continued the tradition. And then I studied painting, and turns out winemaking and running a wine label is a great creative outlet also. So been enjoying figuring out how to dovetail the family legacy and our family business in vineyard management and the archives and what I ended up with was Sutro Wine Company. Thanks for that question. Appreciate that.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question about the conditions of the archive. Do you have suitable environmental conditions there since works on paper can deteriorate? Are there any plans to donate some of that to special collections at Stanford or elsewhere where they can be preserved or conserved?
That is what's happening right now. We're in the process of getting the archives appraised, and then we will be donating them to the Warnecke Institute, which was a nonprofit my dad set up. And when the appraisal, which Paul helped here a bit, got done, we will be donating it, and then we'll be able to apply for funding to help preserve the archives. We have, wanted, and it's my hope that we can keep the archives together. It's quite unique to have 100 years of architectural drawings in the practice. So we're hoping we can do that. Major projects can be donated, the originals, to different institutions, but I think the concept of keeping it whole is what's going to make it so unique into the future. So that's our hope.
Wonderful. Another viewer asks, I'm curious what John Carl Warnecke would have designed should he have had the commission to design the new graduate residences. And I don't know if you've seen those, either of you, Alice or Margot, and what he would have thought of the appearance of the new complex soon to open.
That's a good question. I don't think I've seen them.
I have been down recently for some reunions, some more recent reunions, and I think they're semi respectful of the other buildings that exist, but they seem to really cramp the roads, and there's not a lot of open space to walking through. And so that's just a personal opinion. Yeah, it makes me feel like the colonnaded, walkways and weren't preserved. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, well, I have to admit that since I'm retired now, I don't get down to Stanford that often. And by the new graduate residences, you're talking about the large new buildings that are on out on Sarah Street. Do you think that's what's referred to here, Leslie?
I'm assuming they're the ones that are in what we would call Escondido Village. The Escondido residences, the tall,
very large, tall buildings. Yeah,
and they are a bit tall. Yeah.
Yeah, they're gigantic. Yeah, they just seem, to me, they seem too massive and big. But I'm sure that there were practical reasons why they had to be done like that. I think the question was, how would John Carl Warnecke have designed them? That's very hard to answer hypothetical questions like that about a different time and different circumstances. But in general, I would say that they don't really follow his principles very well. I think partly because if you look at the housing clusters, anyway, you could see that he was trying to avoid large dormitory buildings and trying to break buildings down into smaller elements that had more human scale and so forth. So I think these new buildings are not really in a style that's compatible with Warnecke's principles. But as I say, there may be practical reasons why they had to be like that. I just was kind of taken aback when I saw them recently for the first time.
Well, yeah, and housing is a huge issue today, and density is important.
Yeah.
But I'm sure my dad would have had an opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Leslie?
Yeah, we do. They are coming in. Let's see. We have a
I know there's a
here.
limit to how much time we can spend here, but I'm enjoying trying to answer these questions with Margot and Alice, and so
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
long as we can do it, it's fine with me.
So we have David J. Newman, who has written a note. He says, hello, Margot and Paul. When I met with Mr. Warnecke, he indicated that the location of the post office and bookstore and its arcade on the, quote, backside, as well as the location of Meyer Library, related to a library quad plan. Do the archives have evidence of this major concept?
I might mention who David Newman is. He was the university architect, as many people at Stanford no doubt remember, for many years, and during a period of really great architectural development at Stanford. A lot of important architects that he brought in to design buildings at Stanford in the 1980s and 90s. And so it's nice to hear from David. I'm delighted that he was able to participate in this event. So the question about the concept of a library quad that he was involved in the planning of, I don't know, Margot, do you have any sense of whether there's anything in the archive relating to that development?
Actually, yeah, as I mentioned, we welcome people to come up. We do have important cron files of his business that go all the way back and are often fascinating for historians to go through. We also have project files and drawings. So it really is fun to work with historians to come up and then unroll project drawings and discover these kinds of things. So that's the value of an architectural archive. Yeah. So as far as, I know there's a whole section on Stanford, and the cron files, again, are valuable for that kind of research.
Well, maybe David and I could come up sometime, and I'm sure he'd enjoy visiting the archive.
That'd be great. That'd be fun. We do get a lot of historians right now. The National Parks are doing a research project on the Sillamar to make it a National Historic Landmark, and they also are in the process of nominating my father as a National Historic Architect, which and makes it easier to then nominate other buildings that he's designed. So it's amazing, 50 years now, everything's historic, but.
Okay, let's see, Scott writes, are there any physical architectural models, Margot and Alice, in the archives behind you or elsewhere?
Unfortunately not. They did not get preserved, which is really too bad. Frank Gehry's architectural archives are in numerous warehouses and whole buildings devoted to them. But we ended up here, delightfully for us, in this amazing old dairy barn. So not room for everything.
I do remember you do have some of your grandfather's beautiful Beaux-Arts drawings, those large watercolor drawings.
Right. Those are great.
They're really gorgeous drawings, and the two that I showed in my talk were ones that are there at the archive that I photographed. They're a bit hard to photograph through glass, but I did that last time I was up at the archive, you may recall.
Yeah, we do have all the original Beaux-Arts drawings, which, and all of my grandfather's work, which are incredible to dive into, because each project are full-scale, hand-drawn details that were, used at the time to actually build the buildings, and they are really beautiful. Each one of those, I wish I had one I could pop it forward, but each one of those projects are, just fascinating.
So we do have some people who are interested in visiting the archive. Is that possible? How does one arrange a visit if you allow that?
Yeah, on the website we have, so the Warnecke Institute, which my dad founded, includes the architectural archives and also an artist residence program. So if you go to our website, either warneckeranch.com or to Chalk Hill Artist Residence, we're at Chalk Hill in Sonoma County, you will see there's an application to just contact us. And we love giving tours, so happily give a tour. We've done tours for buses of people if we get back to that state again. But you're also welcome to come up individually for a tour. So we're on the ranch, ranching and farming and taking care of the vineyard, and we're available. And we're available to give tours.
Better watch out. You might have a flood of people coming down your
Good, good. Be welcome. We'll stay 6 feet away. Alice is my niece.
We're co-sheltering.
Excellent. One person asks, what did, or do we know what Warnecke thought of Olmsted? Would he have known about Olmsted's plan for Stanford?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember that, him mentioning that in his memoir, though it's possible. I just don't remember it. But absolutely, from being a Stanford student, he would have definitely known about. He was obviously very interested in the historical architecture at Stanford. That clear from his 1949 report. And so he would have known of Olmsted's involvement in the design of the quad. Wouldn't you say, Margot and Alice?
Absolutely. I think he often did a lot of historical background research on projects, and with my grandfather's Beaux-Arts background, I'm pretty sure he was aware of that. And we didn't really talk about the influence of Gropius too much, but that was also a fascinating part of his memoir, that the influence of that. But anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, someone else asks, Warnecke received the commission to do the Kennedy Library in Cambridge just before the assassination. Do you know why the Kennedy family terminated the agreement and gave the commission to I.M. Pei?
Yeah, why don't you address that, Margot? Because I think you may know more about that than I do.
Well, again, he talks about this in his memoir quite extensively, and it is a fascinating story. The Kennedy family interviewed numerous architects, and my father actually organized the competition, of which he was one of the architects considered. And so I think, the whole stories around this are really interesting. But I think in the end, Jackie was always very, she liked Pei. And she liked his architecture. It did end up taking, I don't know how many years to get built, but that's another part of the bigger story, which is in the memoir. So.
Yeah, but my understanding is that during Kennedy's lifetime, before he was assassinated, when that he really was. Since he worked so closely with Warnecke on these various projects, that he had in mind that Warnecke might very well design the library. Do you think that's true?
Oh, I do. He did work with Kennedy on the selection of the library site,
Right.
And so there's documentation of that here, and that was, you know, a large part of why I think he, you know, he had to accept the fact that he didn't get that commission, but nonetheless, he, you know, had the other opportunities to work with the family. So.
Right.
Could either of you speak to what current architects did Warnecke influence the most?
Who did he launch?
Oh, well, yeah, that's true. Just within his,
Firm.
within the firm, many architects evolved out of, like Peterson Fox and numerous other important architectural firms today. It's interesting, his design philosophy, which I think he really truly believed in, was in collaboration with architects in design as well as in practice. And individuals within his firm, he really gave opportunities to design and be project architects, so to speak, which he worked with them in that process. But not every architect of his era certainly did that. And I think it describes a lot of the difference in his architecture in different parts of where he designed in cities. And interesting, yeah, like, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I'm trying to remember in reading his memoir, I believe he talks about how toward the end of his career, he spent a lot of time supporting the careers of younger architects. And I'm trying to think of some, he specifically mentioned some, and was Michael Graves one of them? Or do you remember any of the people who younger architects whose careers he supported in various ways? Or
yes, and actually I was actually involved in a lot of the joint ventures when I worked in the New York office. So the firm worked with Frank Gehry on a couple of projects. One interesting project for putting a chain link fence on the Brooklyn Bridge. No, not the other, Manhattan Bridge, sorry. And he also worked with Michael Graves, did a joint venture for the Humana building in Louisville, Kentucky. And we talked to people like Jim Sterling. At that time of his career, he had developed a very, I guess, like very accomplished project management, and architects could then, who were younger, use the experience of these more technical construction management project managers. So that's how many of these joint ventures evolved at that time. But it was very exciting to work with people like Michael Graves, who I got to know, and Frank Gehry and others. So that was interesting.
Yeah. But to get back to the question about his influence on recent architects or modern architects, contemporary architects, I think that because he was a pioneer in what came to be called contextualism, which is much more common today, and really that you could say that he influenced many architects who in the following years, because they adopted in one way or another some of these contextual approaches. Wouldn't you say, Margot?
Absolutely. He really was a pioneer of contextual design, and people who look at that as an important contribution to designing anywhere. He is one of the people that I think in his career shows that his sensitivity to working in different environments.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we've just about come to the end of the time for our program, and we did receive quite a few questions, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to every single one of them. But I just want to say thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Margot and Alice, for taking the time to spend with us and to share, Paul, for sharing your insights into the fascinating life of a truly interesting contributor to the Stanford campus as we know it today, and to Margot and Alice for sharing your family's rich history with us.